Hello, my name's Jane Koenig, and I'm a professor in the Department of Environmental Health in the School of Public Health at the University of Washington. I've been in the department since 1974. To step back a bit then, actually I was born in Seattle, but I didn't live here until I was 19. And I got my undergraduate and master's and PhD all from the University of Washington. My PhD was granted in 1963, and then I went off. I was married at the time, and my husband and I went to Palo Alto, California. He had a position at the Palo Alto VA Hospital, and I did a postdoctoral fellowship in pharmacology. I was studying behavioral pharmacology. Then my husband got a job in Albuquerque, New Mexico, at the University of New Mexico, and I ended up at the University of New Mexico in the physiology department for 5 years. And then we were divorced, and I decided I would like to come back to Seattle. I found a job as a visiting assistant professor in neurological surgery, and I was there for a year. And then I did some teaching in zoology, and actually I took over a class that was taught by Dixie Lee Ray because she was otherwise occupied as the governor. And I happened to see in Science magazine an advertisement for a position in the Department of Environmental Health. And the position was described as they were looking for somebody who would develop a program to study the health effects of air pollution in human subjects. At that time, they were doing research. The person who hired me, whose name was Robert Frank, was doing research with guinea pigs and studying the effects of air pollution, mostly sulfur dioxide in guinea pigs. He had a grant from EPA, and he had a grant from NIOSH, and actually he hired me for that job. And he also hired Mike Morgan, who's a professor at the University of Washington, and we both started in October 1974. My initial position was a research associate, I'm pretty sure. But there was a movement within the school, and the dean was Robert Day. There was a movement in the school to move people in research positions onto the faculty, and so then I became a research assistant professor, which was nice for me. And it was very interesting. This was research. I was actually trained more like as a neurophysiologist. I was doing neurophysiology at the University of New Mexico. And then now I found myself in the field of respiratory physiology. And there was a bit of an adjustment period. What really attracted me a lot to the job was the immediate understanding of the potential value of the research for society. The Clean Air Act was passed in 1970, and the Environmental Protection Agency was charged with setting standards that would protect the public health, setting standards for the common outdoor air pollutants. And those are the ones that we ended up studying in the laboratory that we developed on the 5th floor of the F-Wing. It was really it was really a fun time. We were working with a lot of different people. As I said, they were doing research on guinea pigs, and we stuffed the guinea pigs into mayonnaise jars and sealed put a seal around their neck, and then you can measure the pressure of their, you can measure lung function by measuring the compression of the chest as they breathe in and out. That was what was called a guinea pig plethysmograph. Well, next door I had a wooden human plethysmograph, which is a really strange looking thing. There was a globe on the top of it, and we put people in there and fasten the whole thing down, and looks like you're going to be blasted off to the moon. But in the plethysmograph, you measure the pressure when people breathe in and out, pressure, and they have their mouth and a mouthpiece, and the flow, and then you can measure the resistance of the lung. And of course, the design of our studies was to compare exposure to outdoor levels of air pollution to equal exposures to clean filtered air, and make decisions about use lung function measurements in the plethysmograph and other things, other ways of measuring it, to determine whether there was any difference between sulfur dioxide or sulfuric acid or ozone and the clean air exposure. And then, stepping back a little bit to how we got off, as I mentioned, it was my job and Mike Morgan's job to begin to study human subjects as well as the ones that were being studied with the guinea pig. And in the course of doing that, we met Robert Frank, who was a physician who had come to the University of Washington pretty much from Harvard. He went to Utah. I don't know if it was the University of Utah or Brigham Young. He was in Utah for a year, but then he came to the University of Washington, and he was hoping to develop this program on the health effects of air pollution. And actually, he met atmospheric scientist Robert Charlson, who is a very well-known atmospheric scientist. And Bob Charlson and Bob Frank would sit around and talk and say, well, Bob Charlson would say, this is what is happening in the atmosphere, and that they would try to decide how they could determine whether what was happening in the atmosphere was having any effect on human health. And so one of the things that we needed to do was recruit subjects to and we started with some adult subjects. We would advertise on bulletin boards and word of mouth and get people to come in and agree to breathe a small amount of sulfur dioxide or a small amount of, or clean filtered air. And as I said, we would do these studies. We carried the studies out during intermittent exercise to mimic what goes on outside in the when people are actually exposed to air pollution. Usually they're not just sitting still, they're walking around outside. And we wanted to, and walking around increases ventilation, and so if we studied them sitting still, we wouldn't be capturing the effect of increased ventilation that actually would have people breathing more when they were outside. But it turned out then that a pediatric allergist, William Pearson, also learned of these studies and introduced himself to Bob Frank. And it turned out then that William Pearson and I worked together very closely. We recruited adolescent subjects from his clinic. It's the Northwest Asthma and Allergy Clinic on Sandpoint Way. It's a very large clinic now. When at that time there were only 4 members in the clinic, and Bill Pearson and I, as I said, worked together very closely. He would go through his patient files and pick out appropriate subjects for us, and then I would call them. And it was an extremely productive relationship. Even though we were essentially the same age, I considered him my mentor because he taught me everything I know about asthma. I didn't know much about asthma up until that time. And it turned out that an adolescent with asthma was a really unique subject to use in an air pollution study. We often talk about people with asthma as being like the canary in the mine. In the canary in the mine, people took canaries down to the mine, and if they got sick and died, the miners would realize there might be something that they needed to check on. And truly, similarly, people with asthma who already are having breathing difficulties can give us, society, a hint of what it's like to breathe air pollution. We have found that air pollution studies are most useful when we study susceptible members of the population. And certainly most everybody would agree that these young children with asthma represent the susceptible population. And so we went through all the different kinds of asthma, and we went through a lot of different kinds of air pollution. And they were very interesting studies. At the same time, there were things going on politically in our little group, the air pollution group at the University of Washington. Turns out that Bob Frank and Bob Day didn't get along very well. And John Wilson was actually the chairman of the Department of Environmental Health at that time. And he and Bob Frank didn't get along very well. There may have been a theme there somehow. Anyway, Bob Frank got mad and left. And then I kind of inherited the leadership of this particular part of the air pollution research, the human studies with children. And I got funding for a number of years from NIEHS and carried out a lot of interesting studies. Tragically, Bill Pearson had a stroke in 1991, and is in a nursing home and is really not cognizant of what's going on, and I miss him very much. And like to say, at opportunities like this, how much I appreciate the collaboration that I had with him. The collaboration was not only with Bill Pearson; it was really became part of the family at Northwest Asthma and Allergy. And this summer we had another blow when Gail Shapiro, who is a very prominent pediatric allergist herself, died during surgery. Well, after Bob Frank left, the department when I came in 1974 was mostly industrial hygiene, personified by Pete Pricey, and sanitation, personified by Jack Hatlin. And they were the two senior people in the department. And then, of course, there was Bob Frank, but then he left. And there was a feeling, I think, in the school, and I don't know the politics of this, it was decided that Department of Environmental Health needed some restructuring and some regrowth, and the school decided to recruit a new chair. And I know several people applied, and maybe other interviews will be able to tell you who those were, but one of the candidates was a person by the name of Gilbert Omen, and he ended up being the second chairman of environmental health during my stint. And it turned out, it was interesting for me because Gil Omen, right before he came to the department, had been working on a committee that was reevaluating the ozone standard for EPA. And so he had, at that time, a fairly significant interest in air pollution. And of course, I had this interest in air pollution. And so when doing the first couple of at first, Gil Omen and I worked together on air pollution, and we actually wrote a chapter in a book together. But Gil Omen, I think, stayed chairman for about 10 months, and then Bob Day had decided to step down as dean, and next thing we knew, Gil Omen was dean of the School of Public Health. And I think at the same time, and then we had people from. We had two acting chairs while we were doing our search for a permanent chair because Gil Omen was kind of otherwise occupied being the dean. But the search ended up with us hiring a very well-known toxicologist, Sheldon Murphy. And he then became the third chair under which I served. And as I said, Sheldon Murphy was a very well-known toxicologist, and his influence was to develop a strong toxicology program here at in environmental health. Right before Sheldon Murphy came, we hired a young toxicologist. We didn't. I would say there was one person in the department, Foppe de Waal, had some money, and he wanted somebody in toxicology, and he hired a young toxicologist who just graduated from the University of Kansas, David Eaton. And Dave Eaton and I shared an office for a while, and Dave was a very overworked single toxicologist in the department for a while until Sheldon Murphy came, and then we hired Elaine Fossman and Kurt Omenschitsky, and I guess as they say, the rest is history. I do have one story about Dave Eaton. I mentioned that Dave was the token toxicologist here for a while, and this was during one of the times when the state or the county decided to spray for the gypsy moth. And I remember going to a public hearing where Dave was trying to reassure the audience that spraying with BT was safe in residential areas. And he was very patient, and he had a thankless job where, in a situation like that, where the audience is predisposed to assume that they're going to get a snow job and that people will tell them it's all going to be okay. And I thought he did a very good job. Oh, and when Sheldon came, he brought with him his postdoctoral fellow. Sheldon came from, I think, the University of Texas in Houston. Well, that postdoctoral fellow came as an assistant professor, and that was Lucio Costa. We all looked at Lucio's CV, and he had published more papers than most of the other people in the department who were much senior to him. And so then we developed a very, I think, well-respected division of toxicology within environmental health. Speaking of, I've spoken of several of the departmental chairmen. John Wilson, followed by Gil Omen, and then Sheldon Murphy. Sheldon Murphy, unfortunately, died of cancer probably 5 or 6 years after he became our chairman. I don't know how many years. And then the dean, which must have been Bob Day, asked Gerald Van Bell, a professor in biostatistics, if he would be the acting chair for a year. And even before that, when I was doing air pollution studies, I had asked Gerald Van Bell to help me out on statistical problems, and he had another technician working in the lab then, Quentin Hanley, who was able to pick up a lot of the statistics, and so I had already, I kind of welcomed having Gerald be the chair because he was somebody I already knew. And we interviewed a number of people, and we decided that we didn't like any of them better than Gerald, and so we asked him if he would be, if he would take the job, and he had to give a formal seminar then, because that's part of the process. And he told us, he said, you guys are more fun than the biostatisticians. So we liked him saying that. I don't know. I think the biostatisticians probably are a lot of fun too. But then Gerald decided to step down, and we had a hard time finding we interviewed a number of people, and nobody really seemed to fit. And then Dave Kalman moved into that position. And I continued on with my air pollution studies. There's another aspect. I talked about the collaboration with physicians, William Pearson, but the other part of the air pollution picture was the strong dependence we had with the atmospheric science part of air pollution. And I mentioned that this group, air pollution group, got going between the collaboration with Bob Charlson and Bob Frank. Well, Bob Charlson had a recent graduate, and he, by the name of Dave Covert, who became part of the air pollution group. And of course, Dave was an atmospheric scientist and knew how to combine air pollutants in a way that was natural. So when we exposed people to a mixture of air pollution, it was one that actually occurred outside. And then at the same time, we hired a postdoctoral fellow by the name of Timothy Larson, who had just gotten his degree as well. And, of course, now Dave Covert stayed in the department for quite a while, but finally went back to atmospheric science he was joint with atmospheric science, but he became primary with atmospheric sciences probably about 10 or 15 years ago. And Timothy Larson was hired as a professor in civil and environmental engineering. And Tim and I have worked together really since 1974. And after the Bob Frank era and the William Pearson era were kind of winding down, we got funding from EPA with some assistance from the Department of Ecology to look at air pollution in Spokane. And we called this the Spokane Particulate Matter study. We paired with a engineer over at Washington State University, Candace Claiborne, and she was working on a wind erosion project over in Spokane. And the Spokane air particulate matter study grew out of residents' concerns in Spokane. And people living in Spokane would call their physicians and talk to the air pollution people, and they wanted to know whether the wind-blown dust storms that were very prevalent, there had been a drought, I think, and for about 8 years there had been wind-blown dust storms, and people were concerned, is it safe for my children to go out and play, and questions like that. And so that was the impetus for our study. And so, due to Murphy's Law, when our study started, the drought ended, it got rainy, and we used to have jokes about the wind-blown mud, you know. But we were still able to carry out these studies. We worked with one of our collaborators, was Joel Schwartz, who is a very well-known air pollution researcher. He was at EPA originally. He's now at the Harvard School of Public Health, and he's a John and MacArthur Fellow, Catherine T. John and Catherine T. Genius. And I will say he is a genius. And it was a lot of fun working with him and with Candace, and we had wonderful cooperation from people in Spokane. There were 4 hospitals, and it was my job to get them to give us emergency room data on a daily basis so we could compare it with daily air pollution. And we ran into a recently retired physician whose name is Robert Steer, who was an expert in molds and pollens, and we talked to him a lot. He was very helpful in our studies. At the same time, the Department of Ecology was under pressure to do something about agricultural burning, which is another source of air pollution in Spokane, as well as wind-blown dust, and of course wood stoves and automobiles, which are traditional and not in any way specific to Spokane. And so we tried to balance all these different needs from the community with the research that we were able to do. It was difficult to help the people who were concerned about agricultural burning because that took place outside of Spokane, and the fixed monitors where we were getting our air pollution data were ones that were set in Spokane. But we did the best we could, and we went to hearings and tried to answer people's concerns. And it turns out that our study of particulate matter in Spokane was we were just getting in on what was becoming a major concern for EPA. EPA was under a lot of pressure to try to understand particulate matter, which is a very different kind of pollution than the other pollutants that are regulated by EPA, the outdoor pollutants. The other ones are gases, and you know what you have. Your ozone, SO2, nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide. These can all be measured very simply with dedicated monitors. But what is particulate matter? And it's all the aerosols, the smoke, haze, and everything, that all the non-gaseous pollutants in the air. It's very complicated, and it's in the eastern part of the United States, it's sulfuric acid. Maybe in the west, it's wood smoke. And EPA was under a lot of pressure to try to know more about particulate matter. And the National Academy of Sciences was asked by Congress to do a review of the research needs to try to understand the health effects of air pollution. And one of their recommendations was that EPA should fund some particulate matter health centers. And so as the Spokane project was winding down, an RFA came out for these centers, and we already had our multidisciplinary group. We had Spokane, and we had, of course, the civil and environmental engineering and atmospheric sciences. And we also had been worked with people in biostatistics. Leanne Shepard was part of the PM, Spokane PM research group. And in fact, that group, a lot of the work was done by a PhD candidate in engineering who actually did all his work in the F-wing in my lab, Gary Norris, who's now a senior scientist at EPA. And so, we had a history of working together, and so we thought, of course, that we should apply. And this was in 1998, and we wrote up a proposal and sent it off, and it was waited nervously to find out, and it turned out that 5 centers were funded in that first go-around, and ours, which we called the Northwest Particulate Matter Center, to take consideration of it was the Northwest. It wasn't just Seattle, and it wasn't just the University of Washington. It was the Northwest. And so that allowed us to continue our work on particulate matter and really to ratchet it up a couple of notches. So it was really, of course, we think very cutting-edge research. We had a couple of extensions, and the PM Center officially was finally no longer around at all on December 31st, 2006. And we are we'll be writing final reports, and we'll be publishing stuff from the PM Center for quite a bit of time, I expect. One new member to our group that was very important was Sally Liu. And Sally Liu was a surprise hire, actually, for the University of Washington. That division, which is now called environmental health, was looking for somebody with expertise in water quality. But when Sally came, but it didn't say that in the advertisement for a position, and so it was a little unclear. And Sally applied for it, and her her seminar was so good, everybody was so impressed with her, that we hired her. And so that was really great for the air pollution group because we got a free boost. And Sally Lou had trained at Harvard with where there's a very strong air pollution group. She was, when we hired her, an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina. And the reason she was looking for a job was that she didn't really have a core group of people at the University of South Carolina. And so when she saw what we had here at the University of Washington in terms of interest in air pollution, it was very attractive to her. It was very attractive to us, though she has now left the department. But I'm sure that her presence was very important for us getting the PM Center. In fact, she had gotten a cooperative agreement from EPA about a year before the center was funded, and that was very instrumental in us getting the PM Center. Now that we come to 2007, our PM, the information that we've all that we developed in the PM Center has had some very important spin-offs. One of them is a grant from EPA given to Joel Kaufman, which was widely described as the largest grant that EPA had given to an individual scientist, $30 million over 10 years. And that grant is to look at a cohort of people and estimate their exposure to air pollution, a cohort that's being studied for in its own right. The MESA study, which I don't remember what the acronym is, but it's minority people with cardiovascular disease, and they're being studied from the time they are were enrolled about 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, and they come in for regular clinic visits. And so there's a lot of really nice clinical data on them. And those data can be used for other purposes. And the purpose Joel Kaufman is thinking about is determining the effect that air pollution has on the onset or the aggravation of the cardiovascular outcomes in that group. And another spin-off has been what we call the Border Air Quality Study. And this is the study that Tim Larson, Catherine Carr, and Timothy Gould, so Tim Larson from Civil and Environmental Engineering, Catherine Carr, who just recently got who is a physician, a pediatrician, and recently got a PhD in epidemiology, and she's now an assistant professor in pediatrics. So, and Timothy Gould, who's a research scientist in civil and environmental engineering. We are a little small group who is collaborating with the University of British Columbia and the University of Victoria to develop models for exposure to traffic in the Puget Sound and in the Georgia Basin, and compare those two airsheds and compare and contrast the kinds of health effects that we see. And we're not only looking at estimating traffic exposures, we also, Tim Larson's also developing a model using the new geographical information system capabilities that allow a person to map people around a geographical area and then determine whether their location has higher or lower air pollution. And we're looking Tim is developing maps, both models, both for traffic and for wood smoke. Those are the two prominent sources of particulate matter in both Seattle and Vancouver. And this research has been funded by Health Canada, which is a new funding for our group. And we've really enjoyed working with the investigators. We have meet about twice a year and share our findings. And so air pollution studies are continuing at the University of Washington. I have been very fortunate in these last few years in terms of the colleagues that work with me in my lab. And one of those, these are both young women that support me. I wouldn't still be at the University of Washington if they weren't there to help me out. One is Karen Jansen, who has been the research scientist and run my lab for many years with some hiatuses. She's now a graduate student getting her master's in environmental health. And the other is Therese Marr, who got a PhD in our department, and I think she was awarded her PhD about 1999. She worked then in my lab as postdoctoral fellow for 2 years, and then she did a lot of the analyses for the manuscripts that we published with the PM Center. And Therese now is teaching in the transition school, but she works in my lab for the 2 months during the summer, and we have a lot of fun working together. And in general, even though I think the brain is more exciting than the lung, I'm glad that I took this job working with in the field of the health effects of air pollution. I've gone to some very interesting meetings and met some very fascinating people. And one of them, I will close with this. I've been very fortunate at getting to know the father of air pollution epidemiology, who is David Bates, who died in November 2006. David was the emeritus dean of the medical school at the University of British Columbia. And he started out at McGill and carried out the first, that I know of, controlled exposures to ozone. And we were very fortunate at the University of Washington because David lived just up in Vancouver, and we could ask him to come down frequently. And having him talk and describe research needs was just remarkable. He served as a consultant to the Spokane PM Center project, and then when we got our PM Center, one of the requirements was that we would have an outside science advisory committee, and I asked David to chair that, and he did. And we will never forget all the assistance he gave us and all his wonderful insights into the interactions between air pollution and respiratory health. And so, goodbye, and thank you for letting me tell you my story.